Warning: the following audio production contains scenes that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. A Fright for PC length. Based on the Railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. Written and read by TARDIS9. The Express is a long, heavy train. Each day, Pip and Emma find their coaches in the yard after another engine arranges them and bring them to the station. Then, they collect their passengers and hurry off to London and back. They are kept very busy. The train is often full of important people like the Fat Controller and must always run right on time with all rolling stock working well. However, over time, some coaches are left in the yard. Usually, this is simply because they are in need of some maintenance. But sometimes, they are left here because of altogether different matters. One particular coach seemed to stay in the yard regularly, more so than the others. None of the other engines understood why. They all felt it to be a waste of good rolling stock. But Pip and Emma knew and wanted nothing to do with it. Over the years, this same coach fell into disrepair. Its paintwork was sprayed over, its couplings sawn off, and its buffers dented. The police suspected vandalism, and so, with the Fat Controller's permission, arranged to take action. "I still don't know why we're even here, Len," moaned W.P.C. Jan Bridgnorth as they got out of their car and walked slowly towards the coach. "Like I told you, Jan, it's a case of lying in wait," replied P.C. Len. "The chief superintendent reckons it's a bunch of railway vandals using this coach as a target and a base." "Base? For what?" asked Jan. "Well, for carrying out attacks on railway property," explained Len. "We've got a whole yard full of rolling stock around us. You know how it is with kids these days. If they want something, they won't be happy until they get it. And some of them don't care how or what happens." "Yeah, but what about an old factory?" Jan protested. "That would make a much better target. Less out in the open. Even Duke's old shed would be more ideal for a group of criminals than this." But once you have spent the same amount of time in the force as me," said P.C. Len, "then you'll realize that not everything is as it seems." He and Jan looked around the coach, peering at it and making notes. The only noise that disturbed them as they worked was the sound of the engines going by. "Seems relatively in order," said Jan. "The damage doesn't look too bad. My wife is part of the maintenance team at the works. She taught me a bit about fixing rolling stock. Just needs a new set of buffers and couplings and a lick of paint. Other than that, I can't think why it's not in use anymore." "Nor I," agreed P.C. Len. "And yet it seems strange to me that people like the Fat Controller just seem to prefer to leave it to rust away like this. All the more suspicious, if you ask me." "Oh well," he said, looking at his watch. "We'd best be getting back to the station." "Why?" asked Jan. "Well, because we've got to make our reports," replied P.C. Len. "And besides, we've got a stakeout to prepare for. We'll do it tomorrow night. We'd better rest up." Darkness surrounded the yard. Every siding was full. Trucks and coaches stood silently, awaiting the morning when their next journey would arrive. Somewhere, an owl hooted. The sound of feet on ballast could be heard, and soon P.C. Len and Jan emerged from the darkness, torches in hand and wearing high-vis luminescent jackets. Not far away, a whistle could be heard. "Sounds like Henry's on the flying kipper again," observed Jan as the green engine raced by. They watched as the last of the fish fans disappeared into the night, the tail lamp swinging from the brake van as the train moved onwards. Then the two police officers made their way towards the coach once they were sure no one was around. Once they approached the door, Jan put her ear to it. Several voices seemed to be coming from inside.
"Did you get it?"
"Yes, and it's what he needs." "Good. How much?" "An arm and a leg. Shall we do it tonight?"
"Yeah. You know the plan. We wait here until I give the signal. Then we clobber him."
Jan looked at P.C. Len. His face told her everything. "You heard it too?" she asked. "Yes," said P.C. Len. "Planning something, are they, eh? Well, we'll see about that. Listen, Jan, you take that door. I'll take this one." Jan didn't need telling twice. She knew that, by design, there would be two concealing walls between the doors and the passenger compartment. If both entrances were to be blocked off, then whoever was inside would be trapped. They opened the doors and climbed inside. It was dark and very quiet. The two police officers shone their torches. Row upon row of seats lay before them at either end of the coach. A toilet stood behind P.C. Len. The interior showed that the coach clearly hadn't been cleaned in some time. Cobwebs festooned the bottoms of the seats, and spiders had made their homes in the luggage racks. Confused, the two police officers walked along the aisle, shining their torches on the seats and on the floor. They stopped only when they met each other in the middle. "Did you see anything?" asked Jan. "No," said P.C. Len. "You?" "No," said Jan. "But I know we heard something." "Something's not right here," said P.C. Len. "We'd better report this." He sat down on one seat, facing away from where he had entered, to write this in his notebook. Jan took another seat on the opposite side, facing the same direction. They had only just finished making their notes, and were getting up to resume their inspection, when they heard the sound of a door bang. "Oh, for goodness sake!" groaned P.C. Len. "We'd forgotten the ruddy toilet!" "Never mind that," said Jan firmly. "Come on." They walked quickly and quietly towards the toilet and opened the door. Nothing. "They must have got away. Now the super's gonna have my badge," Jan groaned mournfully. "Oh, I should have retired long before this," muttered P.C. Len before adding, "Well, no use crying over spilt milk. Come on, Jan. We'd better check underneath." He turned and placed his hand on the door handle, hoping to open it and climb back down onto the ballast. But the door wouldn't budge. He pushed hard against it several times, then turned to his colleague. "Here, Jan, you couldn't give us a hand with this, could you?" he said. She placed her hand upon his, and together they leaned against the door as they pushed hard against it. At last it flew open, and they would have fallen out of the coach had they not quickly caught themselves on the handrails by the doorway. Very gently, and trying to understand what was happening, P.C. Len climbed down. Jan shone her torch in the coach once more to double-check everything. Once she was sure all was still, she joined him outside. She closed the door behind them as she climbed down. It closed quickly and easily. Much too easily. Especially considering how difficult it had been to open from the inside. "Curiouser and curiouser," murmured P.C. Len. "I don't like this," shivered Jan. But nonetheless, she directed her torch towards the undercarriage. Acting instinctively, P.C. Len walked around to the other side and did the same. They both walked around the coach, checking the undercarriage. Nothing. They tried looking at it again, this time shining their torches underneath the couplings at both ends. Still nothing. The air grew colder. The voices came again.
"Did you get it?" "Yes, and it's what he needs." "Good. How much?" "An arm and a leg." "Shall we do it tonight?"
Yeah. You know the plan. We wait here until I give the signal. Then we clobber him.
But something did not feel right. None of this made sense. If there were voices, then how come they couldn't see anybody either inside or outside the coach? Then the two police officers noticed something. The ground around the coach was suddenly covered in light. They looked up. Someone seemed to have turned the lights on in the coach. They could see them now, flickering heavily. Very faintly, the two police officers could make out two figures in the coach. A third seemed to be climbing up the steps into it. They opened the door and disappeared inside. "Right," said P.C. Len furiously. "This is it." He had had enough of this whole affair and wasn't intending to be very forgiving towards the inhabitants of the coach. Crossly, he and Jan opened the door and climbed up the steps once more. They could see 3 people, 2 men and a woman. All 3 seemed to be wearing clothing and hairstyles reminiscent of the 1970s. One man in his 20s had brown curly hair and wore a jumper with green disco trousers. The other, well into his 30s, had combed black hair and a moustache, and wore a black leather jacket with blue jeans. He was holding a large suitcase that looked suspiciously heavy. The woman had long blonde hair and wore a bright yellow blouse with an orange miniskirt. "Right," he said. "Drama club's over, everyone." He held out his handcuffs. "You're all under arrest for trespassing on railway property," he exclaimed as he moved towards them. They didn't notice him. "It's all here?" the brown-haired man asked. "Yes," the black-haired man replied. "Didn't you hear him?" Jan demanded. "Enough of the am-jam." Still nothing. The suitcase was handed over to the woman, who held out 3 glasses. Each was filled with a dark liquid that smelt like wine. "Well then," she said, "here's to us." The 2 men took their glasses. "Cheers, cheers," they said, as all 3 clinked their glasses together. They all took a swig at them, despite the protestations of P.C. Len and Jan. Then it happened. As soon as he had taken a gulp, the black-haired man fell to the ground and began choking and spluttering. P.C. Len ran forwards to assist him, while Jan radioed for assistance. He placed his hand under the body and was about to turn him over into a comfortable position, but then stopped. His hand had gone right through the body, and all Jan could pick up on her radio was static. His hand had gone right through the body, and all Jan could pick up on her radio was static. Slowly, P.C. Len got back up. He and Jan looked around, and for the first time, they noticed that the chairs around them were clean, where earlier they had been filthy. But this was nothing compared to the fact that when they looked out of the window, they realized they weren't on Sodor anymore. They could see a large railway yard full of a variety of trucks and coaches. The brown-haired man and the woman could both be seen running across one of these lines. The sound of a horn broke the silence, and the rumbling of a distant express passenger train could be heard approaching them fast. The two police officers could now only watch helplessly as the couple were mown down by the express. Now more terrified than ever before, the pair ran back towards the door and forced it open. They scrambled out into the yard, relieved but also confused to find that they were now back on Sodor. They looked at each other, their faces pale with fright. They said nothing to each other. They had far too much to think about. Instead, they simply walked silently but uncomfortably away, their arms over each other for comfort. As they did so, they passed by an engine shed. They could hear Pip and Emma talking to Denise, the newest engine on the railway. She was waiting to be driven to the works for her overhaul the next day, and was most curious about the abandoned coach. "But why is it abandoned?" she asked. "Well, Denise," replied Pip, "it's a little difficult to explain." "But it makes no sense," Denise huffed. "Why have a coach if you're not even going to use it?" "Well, that's the thing," Emma explained. "We won't be having it anymore. The Fat Controller has arranged everything so that old coach will be used for one last job tomorrow as a testing vehicle for the mended line on Gordon's Hill, and then be taken to the scrap yards." "And a good thing too," shivered Pip uncomfortably. "But why?" asked Denise. "It doesn't look like there's anything particularly wrong with it." "Well, that's just it," began Emma. "I'm afraid something happened in that old coach. Something very serious indeed. Back in the old days, we used to sometimes leave our coaches at Barrow in Furness if we had to stop there for cleaning, refuelling, and, depending on the time, shedding. From what we were told, 2 people entered the coach to be followed by a third later on. They then jumped out of the coach a few minutes after their colleague had arrived, right into the path of an approaching express train. Their bodies were found lying on the tracks the next morning. The body of the third person was found in the coach, appearing to have been poisoned. The police investigated the contents of the suitcase and found it to contain £10 million in cash. They supposed that the couple, who had been wanted for drug dealing, had been given this amount by one of their partners, but instead of simply letting him go free or have a cut, poisoned him to death. Now the ghosts of all 3 haunt that carriage. Oh, Pip and I used to dread having that old coach in our train. We only really brought it to Sodor because there were no more coaches to spare for our passengers. I tell you, we were thankful that the haunting only happened at night, and that we were glad to leave it behind when we could. I saw 2 police officers enter the coach when we took our express. I told the Fat Controller, and he tried to contact them but couldn't get through. Oh, I only hope they were safe." P.C. Len and Jan turned and walked away. They had heard enough. No one, not even Pip and Emma, ever did find out what the 2 officers had seen that night. Both felt that no one would ever believe them even if they told them. They kept their experience a secret, one that they would take to their graves. P.C. Len never returned to the yard again. He resigned from his position a day later and was relieved to hear that the coach had been scrapped. He now lives in a cottage by Edward's branch line, where he sees the engines go by every day. He sometimes talks to them when he can, but when asked about that terrible night, the other engines notice he is unusually quick to change the subject. Jan, however, stayed on in the police force. Eventually, she became a detective inspector, then a detective chief inspector, and finally, the chief of police for Tidmouth. She did sometimes talk with the engines herself, and occasionally paid P.C. Len a visit. But she too never mentioned that one terrifying night. She ignores any questions to do with it, and does her utmost to try and remove it from her mind. As does P.C. Len. And, in a way, they do. When they're awake, that is. But on dark nights, when they are both fast asleep, the pair are sure that, even in their dreams, they can hear the sound of footsteps on ballast, a rusted door opening, and two voices talking to each other. The conversation is brief and blunt. It holds nothing but malicious intentions. It sounds almost like this.
Did you get it? Yes, and it's what he needs. Good. How much? An arm and a leg. Shall we do it tonight?
Yeah, you know the plan. We wait here until I give the signal. Then we clobber him.